Hope everyone is well today.
Yeah, all good. It's Friday.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Still dark in Cape Town, as you can see. Hi, Ludwig.
Sorry, you say it's dark in Cape Town?
Yes, well, it's getting light now, but yes.
Oh yeah.
Hello.
It's a different world there.
Yeah, as you say, and it's been raining. Super.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this talk. We have Ludwig Hansen today joining us. I'm just gonna read a bio, and then he will go through his presentation. So what we'll do is you'll just run through the presentation, and then at the end, like we usually do, we can do some interaction, comments, and questions. So Ludwig teaches and practices architecture and urban design. After qualifying as architect in 1990, he worked for numerous companies in South Africa, Namibia, and Germany before completing his master's degree in human settlements at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. That was 1996. On his return to South Africa, he, together with Paul Weigers, established Urban Solutions, with completed numerous award-winning buildings and urban design projects. Since 2010, he has established Ludwig Hansen Architects and Urban Designer, with a focus on issues of urban regeneration projects, housing, building, and planning in the context of development under scarce resources and the development of higher education institutions. A primary focus for the past 15 years has been the design and development and implementation of two new universities, that is Mpumalanga and Salt Lake in Kimberley. He has also been the campus and urban designer, campus urban designer and architect for the University of Witwatersrand since 2009. He has also acted as urban design and architectural advisor to the Higher Education and Training Department from 2013 to 2021. This role has enabled the documentation of all 26 campuses, the university campuses in South Africa, with its 92 campuses, which is currently assembled into a book to be published this year. Ludwig has been a lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand School of Architecture and Planning since 2008. Sorry. He has lectured and acted as examiner extensively at universities across South Africa and abroad. He holds a PhD from Wits, which is to be published by Routledge also this year. Ludwig, over to you, sir.
Yes, thanks for the kind introduction. Yes, thank you also for asking me to participate and also share some of my experiences, albeit then maybe sometimes limited. I'm just going to put up this presentation. I trust you can see that.
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Okay. Right, colleagues, thanks again. Maybe just as a form of introduction also to the talk this morning, it is based on or it's broadly based on the Urban Design Institute of South Africa Rudolf Uitenbogaert Memorial Lecture, which was held in February, end of February at the University of Pretoria. We had a similar session at UKZN a month later. But I do, so the topic is really about integrated and connected urban design. And it really talks about the idea of consolidation of ideas and people as a collaborative. And it sort of tries to maybe promote an idea or notion that joint efforts and collaboration is far more important than some of the individual endeavors that we have, which probably maybe doesn't sit always so well with the architectural fraternity. So the images that I'm going to share and show today cover sort of a body of work that I've been fortunate to be involved with over the last 25 years here in South Africa, mostly within the urban environment. And I think the talk will try and attempt to, sort of give a representation of all the urban design implementation and regeneration projects that I've been involved with within our in our South African cities. And then secondly, on sort of work mostly ranging on the development of larger institutions, as was mentioned in the introduction, mostly on universities within the Southern African context. This will also maybe so briefly also talk to some of the architectural explorations that have flowed from this. The sort of two primary basis for the talk, or the content of the talk. The first includes quite a bit of work that was done in the late 1990s and early 2000s in collaboration and partnership with Paul Weigers, who unfortunately passed away not so long ago. And with our work at Urban Solutions, much of those projects at that stage were focused on urban regeneration. The practice at that stage was founded by Steve Thorne, who started Urban Solutions in the early 1990s. And these are some of the drawings that were produced during that period by Steve himself, and sort of gave a sort of an understanding of the quality of the work that was produced at that stage. Sort of a large portion of the work at Urban Solutions included work within the inner city of Johannesburg, the work in Baragwanath, Constitution Hill was part of the projects, works in Tshwane, Pretoria, the DTI as such. Much of the work was also, concluded in a very sort of exciting and ever-changing context of post-1994. And as we as young urbanists or architects, rather like many of us, we were faced with sort of the enormity of and demand of change and the living condition of so many of our urban citizens. And it really always created sort of the impression we didn't know where to start, as the realities at that stage facing us, our segregated cities at that stage, and probably still are, it seemed very hard to overcome. So this plan that you're looking at shows the eastern portions of the city of Soweto. It's so typical of the conditions that we found. It shows vast tracts of industrial and mining land around the Baragwanath Hospital, for those who are familiar with it. And it really shows sort of the lack of access to these segregated environments. I also like to always show the image. If you look at the top, I can't really use a cursor, but the top left corner, the form of the Orlando and Deep Kloof developments portions, which are in the form similar to what is happening on the top, the bottom right, which is the correctional prisons. And there is a similarity in the plan. And it does speak to how urban form is in many cases about control, and the panopticon in this case, the form that was used, is and speaks quite clearly to the measure of how these environments were managed. So I think the first steps that we undertook were primarily around trying to normalize connections and integrate these sort of segregated environments to the rest of the city. So it really tried to address also the notion of conformity, speaks of, it tries to redress issues of lacking of identity within these, and the lack of variety and mixture that we found in these sort of segregated areas. A second portion of the sort of talk is, although not exclusively, is more focused on the university developments that I've been privileged to work in. So mostly focused on the two new universities at Salt Lake University in Kimberley and the University of Mpumalanga in Nelspruit. So the the sort of the sort of the sort of the guidelines and the experience gathered from this has been quite valuable in terms of how we try to implement larger scale developments, urban projects, and or campus projects. And I think those sort of guidelines are quite useful in terms of how we take this forward. Although the talk is mostly also around urban issues, I think a lot of the urban design and the space work was sort of evolved into architectural projects, which try to represent some of the spatial principles and urban codes and guidelines that we have put in place. For example, the Baragwanath and Bree Street taxi ranks, as well as in maybe later some of the architectural projects on these campuses, which included for housing and student residence, rather, laboratories and lecture venues and the like. Also, as a final component of some of the work that I've been involved with is the assessment of all 26 universities in South Africa and their sort of 92 odd sub-campuses. And I think that sort of valuable work in essence has been trying to assist the Department of Higher Education and Training in trying to assist the institutions in terms of the infrastructure development. We've also established what we call the Campus Innovation Laboratory at the University of Witwatersrand with Professor Namdi Ele, and really tries to assist larger institutions in their infrastructure spend and the like. We are also involved in the development of 2 further new universities here in one in Ekurhuleni and one in Hammanskraal. So that sort of work is also happening within our research unit. So maybe returning to the sort of focus of the talk. So I think it's centered around sort of 5 distinct urban principles, which are sort of interrelated in terms of their themes. And it sort of gives an understanding of the lens through which we perceive and make decisions when dealing with these sort of larger scale urban developments. The first is maybe just addressing the nature and scale of urban design, because I think sometimes there's a bit of a confusion as to where is its relevance and where does it sit within the built environment profession. Secondly is around the idea of collaboration and participation as a key driver for what we do. So it's a collective process rather than an individual one. And so where participation is really an essential portion of that. The third, it talks about what we would call inquiry by design as a means to gauge also in this participation process and try to extract the needs and requirements of all the stakeholders that we work with. Fourthly, the importance of placemaking as an underlying principle for how we approach spatial development. And then finally, something which has sort of been a challenge for urban planning is how do we implement these sort of strategies and plans as an essential part of urban design as a process. Before we sort of start maybe on this, I'd like to just step back a bit and sketch the sort of context which we work in. This slide, which is taken from Diepkloof, Soweto, across the M1 freeway, looking over the 3 primary slime dumps edging Nasrec, where the World Cup Stadium is. It looks towards sort of the inner city skyline. So this image always, for me, captures the near sinister sort of uncomfortableness of my urban home at the moment, or for the last 30 years at least. The city sort of on the hill is sort of nearly unreachable. It's sort of in a distance away, and it's buffered from Soweto by a belt of mining land. And it's somehow also ironic that mining for gold in our environment has both shaped the sort of the positives as well as the negative faces of our city. So on the one hand, it's sort of enabled the establishment, but it's also been used to create insurmountable sort of divisions between its citizens. So this sort of city, which I call home, and I think it's the same throughout many other cities in South Africa, it's sort of become a sort of field of quite violent contest between sort of the extreme wealth and extreme poverty, between luxury and subsistence excess need. It further shows the sort of the sprawl of our urban condition, and our dependence on vehicular transport, a massive freeway system. When speaking with some time ago with Clive Chipkin, in his publishing of his book, we convinced him to use this as a cover for his book on Johannesburg. Also, we maybe also understanding our cities, we are all too often confronted with escalating crime and violence. The poor are desperate to find someone to find a home or to live, and are often by staying in environments which are not necessarily conducive for that, result in very tragic disasters, very much like this one in August last year. 77 people were killed in a fire in an occupied inner city building. This, together with the last year, last decade, really, the systematic failure of our infrastructure, bulk electricity supply is intermittent. The roads and transport network is failing in a way, and of late, water as a resource has become not only unreliable but unsafe for consumption, and it's a real challenge. And I guess not only in Johannesburg but across some of our other cities. Just as an example, I'm overseeing the University of Witwatersrand's infrastructure and planning department. We've had a fire which has knocked out our electricity for the last 10 days. And trying to operate an institution with 40,000 students is becoming very problematic. And it becomes, in a way, an existential threat to, in this case, the university and big parts of our city. And so these are sort of enormous sort of problems that come with it. And to top all of this, of course, we were confronted with the COVID pandemic, which utterly destroyed sort of our communities, people's livelihood, and actually a sense of optimism. And I think we as urbanists and built environment professionals sometimes feel completely at loss as to how to deal with these sort of challenges that come with it. By attempting, maybe to address some of the sort of the 5 principles or themes that I spoke about, I think maybe I need to give some background also about our city and where the university, for instance, sits within that. I think not everyone comes from Joburg. Most people seemingly also try to avoid it. But it is quite a big sprawling city. It's symptomatic of how a lot of our cities work. It's extremely large, and just in terms of if you look at the radar, in terms of its footprint. And I also want to just maybe also show where the university sits within that. That's sort of the inner city, the CBD of Johannesburg, and the sort of yellow portions. It shows the extent of the institution within that. So it's really embedded in the inner city, and the health of the city equates the health of the university, and these sort of interdependencies are very important. Also, just to give some historical context, there's a triangular piece that is indicated there. That is the origins of the city of Johannesburg, just in terms of where it was established. This gives you the same sort of plan, the sort of same triangular piece as to where the city of Johannesburg was established prior to the discovery of gold. And it's sometimes interesting to understand how do cities evolve, especially in the context of Joburg and the discovery of gold. One can see the various farm portions that were laid out and surveyed prior to that discovery. And it's ironic that, or maybe just not necessarily ironic, but when the gold was discovered, the government at that stage had surveyed a large portion of that, but those portions which weren't surveyed and then would basically acclaimed by either farmer or agriculture would then revert back to the government. In this case, Rijkieslaagte wasn't claimed by anyone, therefore became what is referred to in Afrikaans as uitvalgrond or leftover land. And that was then given to the city to develop. And that's the sort of start of the institution. You can still see the remnants of that. The diagonal axes are still available. The beacons that were set up to mark those are still available. And that's sort of where the city starts, be it as awkward as it might seem. This just gives you an indication of the university within the bigger inner city environment in Braamfontein, which includes basically the portion on either side of the then not yet constructed freeway, which dissected it from the agricultural showgrounds, which then also become part of the university. So I'm using the university as a means to explain the scale and nature of urban design. What you are looking at is the first proposed plan of the university by Lyon and Fallon in 1918. This is as part of an architectural competition and really follows very strict Beaux-Arts principles. It shows at the most southern portion or the bottom end of it, the positioning of a great hall, flanked by administrative and academic buildings, and then cascading all the way to the north and also down the hill, in this case, towards where the student residences are. That's sort of the conceptual plan. But the most striking element is the central space, the open space that is in it. If one goes through the way the institution was developed over time, it was established officially or officially opened in 1922. You can see how that evolved. First of all, the development of, again, the sort of primary academic buildings on the southern portion, and then cascading all the way down to the first residences. So this evolution has one thing always in common, and that is the open space or the common space as the only consistent aspect. That is the framework that we're talking about. This sort of historical image shows the visual axes all the way down the hill. And it is interesting that a swimming pool and the two adjoining towers would be constructed as a first portion to demarcate that space. It sort of amplified that sort of structure. It's also interesting to note that the very great hall that we always see on maybe on photographs is just a facade. It's not a building. So this has been that was a theater piece in a sense to strengthen this visual axis. The building was only completed 15, 20 years later. Something was added behind it. So there wasn't really a functional space. And again, this idea of what is a framework and how do we establish frameworks is quite well amplified by this very same image. So the sort of formal rigor of the original plan steered the positioning of buildings over a good 60, 70 years, or now 100 years, and they're always respecting the library lawns as the guiding element. I've been at Wits for now nearly 15, 20 years. We truly have some of the ugliest buildings in South Africa around the space, but the quality of the space is not necessarily poorer for it because it sort of controls the height, the scale of it, and the consistency that comes with it. In 1984, Wits acquired the former Rand agricultural showgrounds, and this was it lacked complete structure. It wasn't suited for the purpose of an academic institution. And I think the primary focus since my involvement has always been to reconstruct or reimagine it in the same way that the historical campus was done, by focusing on the establishment of open spaces and the quality of those to guide the development of buildings in and around them. So the notion over the last 15 years is trying to look at the establishment of the element of structure built in an open space structure to ensure that the same kind of qualities are sort of achieved, and to a certain extent they have. Also, I think when dealing with the issue of scale in urban planning, one does feel slightly overwhelmed, you know, especially when in the context of some of the urban decay we spoke about, and the sort of dire need for urban regeneration. And the sort of image that I'm showing does not necessarily highlight urban issues, but it sort of highlights the experience we have in Mpumalanga at the moment, which is the sort of complete devastation of our natural landscape as well as a productive landscape, and sort of the devastation of the coal mining industry that it has on our country. I'm using this extreme example as of the introduction of maybe a solution to some of the environmental regeneration processes, because it's sometimes not in the large-scale intervention where the solution sits. It's sometimes in the smaller interventions, and the introduction of, in this case, of a dung beetle in the sort of devastated landscape of the mining landscape. This is sort of research done at UP and Nelson Mandela University by Professor Dabrowski, which introduces cattle farming and dung beetle into a devastated environment to rehabilitate sort of degraded soil. I mean, I might not do justice to this research, but it's in that small type of intervention we sometimes need to look, rather than the sort of big bang, large scale approaches, which always are quite expensive and probably not very feasible to do. To take that a point further, maybe in a smaller scale, in an urban scale rather, you know, to introduce something quite tiny as an urban catalyst to revitalize an urban area or a street. So this is an example of my own. This is my office and home in Parkview. It's opposite a primary school. So I introduced just a large garage door with a seat, or bench rather, and a water fountain. A small gesture rather. But the small gesture very quickly becomes a waiting station for the parents picking up their children. The children use it as a point to safely cycle. Cyclists and joggers reroute their routes to pass the water point. The local security patrols are using it as a waiting station. And this sort of seemingly very insignificant intervention demonstrated that suddenly there's a complete different use of the street or that edge. And again, I think it's a sort of, we always think too easily about large interventions rather than looking at the smaller interventions. And it offers means for smaller groups or individuals to make changes within their own context. So that brings me sort of to the second principle, which maybe is the primary drivers, is the idea of the collectiveness of urban planning. So the collaboration between multiple stakeholders. And, so in my view, similar to sort of those ideas by Dwayne, Zybrick and Hegeman, is that the city is an urban condition. It's like a people's art. It's a shared experience. It's participation on a grand scale to express certain values to which we as citizens give credits. And I think that's sort of the underlying task of what urban designers should be doing, is to conceive an idea which is reflective of that and nurture it and grow it in the collective minds of that very community. And with that in mind, I really believe that that involvement is the key spatial experience. And we as urban designers should strive to not total involvement, but as inclusive involvement as possible, and think holistically to achieve an integrated and sort of mosaic of spaces and places, pleasing mosaic of spaces and places. I've also sort of come to understand that through practice experience that as I mentioned before, our urban environments are fraught with complexities that require a broader, in-depth understanding of the inner workings, and that they need to be integrated with the urban form at various levels, and must involve those citizens, or to ensure we must involve the people of that community to have a way forward. I also subscribe to the idea that the city can be defined as nearly as a sort of a man-made ecosystem, which requires diversity to sustain itself. And this diversity inherent in our cities, developed organically over a long period of time. And those varied components are sort of interdependent in mirrored ways. And by changing some of these smaller interventions, sometimes has major unintended consequences. Diversity also is not only refers to mixed-use buildings, typologies, or function, or its users, but also talks about the methodology to engage with that end user. The incorporation into the design process of a broader sample of stakeholders is key to ensuring diverse, sustainable results. And the principle of participations are probably best, in my view, in my experience, demonstrated in projects which involved the informal users of our cities, primarily the street traders, the taxi industry, in this case in Johannesburg. So a large part of the work in the 1990s and early 2000s revolved around working with the informal users in our cities. And here broader participation played a significant role to first of all establish sort of spatial strategies, but also provide more civic building responses to a sector largely ignored in the past within our cities, and in my view has and still has dire consequences by ignoring it. It is also through these sort of projects that we come to understand that we get to learn who we are chiefly through contact with others. Since the community holds the collective personality and of the whole, and with these sort of sustained connections and continued conversations, the participants in these communities, regardless of their degree of inclusion, develop emotional bonds, intellectual pathways to mutually understand and have better abilities to problem solving within that community. And it's only through layered and collective sort of collaboration that I think the sustainable solutions can be achieved. And it also sort of offered a framework to ingrain or incorporate the sort of unrecognized, in this case, the taxis and the traders. So the minibus taxis and the informal street traders, as in many other cities, became increasingly prominent in our cities in the 1980s, growing over time into sort of industries of size of proportions, impacting the city in an increasingly dynamic manner. But due to these sort of informal beginnings and operations, they were long regarded as illegal citizens. They are exposed to abuse, extortion, forceful removals, and whilst not providing them with any status within the city, they occupied whatever space or underutilized land or pavement or vacant land that was around. So the city councils at that stage in the late 90s realized very quickly that they had to address the needs and requirements of both taxis and traders. And at that stage, together with the Johannesburg Inner City Office, we developed sort of an inner city street trading management strategy, which involved a survey and multiple work sessions with especially the traders who had no representation at that stage. The resultant proposals sort of aim to integrate the street trader into the sort of the mainstream urban economy, and giving them legal status by establishing a series of markets or market spaces for them to trade from. Hereby, so people sometimes controversially were moved into centralized markets, and the first example of that is the sort of Rocky Street market in Yeovil, which housed at that stage approximately 300 traders. The new building as a typology in Yeovil was, although has grown to become very successful, and still operates to this day, way beyond my expectations, especially with the sort of quite lightweight construction or flimsy construction that we have applied. This is already 30 years ago. The realization also that traders couldn't maybe sustain themselves independent of the rest of the city functions, especially in activities relating to the taxi industry and the sort of close association between those. A further project was developed which integrated taxis, buses, traders, formal retail, and a variety of other civic functions, creches and the like, in the design of the Bree Street taxi rank or Metro Mall. So these sort of principles that we experienced in Yeovil, we applied on a much grander scale with over 200,000 commuters, 2,500 taxis, and 800 street traders, all in quite close, in two central buildings. It's sort of built on the spatial framework in terms of the urban regeneration, vacant land within the city. And it involved over 70 stakeholder engagements in terms of how flow worked, and those engagements really steered the brief, which is contrary to sometimes where the architectural brief is sort of done in isolation in many ways. It also, in terms of in our work with the street traders and the taxi industry, it sort of deserved a much more civic building, or the structure of it is similar to what we would say a train station and the like. And I think the architecture also indicates a significant shift away from sort of dealing with this industry primarily in terms of permanence. And I think that's where stereotype taxi ranks dotted around the cities are always sort of flimsy, feel that they can be moved at any given moment. And I think that sort of is consciously done in terms of the development of Bree Street. Sort of the artist consultation we had at Bree Street or Metro Mall, also gave a bit of a reality check to us in terms of how we tried to over-design in a way the space. We took the information and maybe were too restrictive in our designs, because the taxis, for instance, reversed the flow very quickly after realizing that it wasn't working too well. So I think, again, when looking at it in the Baragwana transport interchange and market, we were far more open-ended. So we just gave structure of where taxis and traders can operate, where it suits them, rather than being too descriptive. And in a way, the way the Baragwana taxi rank was developed over what is 1.5 kilometer long building, is basically just give a skeleton where the users can then operate within, and it's a far more robust development than, for instance, some of our earlier examples. The other aspects of collaboration is how do we sort of realize in a way that the process of architecture, and even more so when we do large urban developments, have become so institutionalized that people seldom have any outlet or way into the process. So we have we cede that responsibility to technical experts, in this case architects or urban designers, to do the work. And I think so. One of the parallel processes that we introduced, and we still try to do in all our projects, is to research ways to integrate and benefit the end user who's mostly unemployed or poor into the construction process. And so a variety of schemes, in this example is an artworks program, was established to get artists or out of the immediate community to decorate the building. Not only artists, we took people off the street, taught them how to do mosaics and the like, so that in the end, I think we employed over 35 to 40 artists just to decorate the buildings, not only the decoration, but also some of the functional aspect, be the doors and the like. So it's not only beneficial to the broader community, but it makes the building instruction something the end users can associate with. And even, today, 25 years or 20 years after finishing the project, when going through that building, people still stop me and, remind me of the certain things that they participated in, which I think shows that the value of that collaboration. Now, broad participation is obviously key within the urban process. And it has been applied with varying degrees of success. I'm not claiming that everything is always smooth and sailing, of course not. But one of the more demanding examples was a peri-urban development with the sort of aim to integrate communally owned land into Umtata city in the Eastern Cape. And in this case, it's not so much the design which was a challenge. It was actually the process of releasing the land over time, ensuring a productive landscape while slowly developing one portion to the next. And this design of the approach and the engagement with the affected stakeholders was the far greater and more intensive process, or part of the design of the framework. So the design of the process is equally important over and above what the design does in the end. It really speaks also to the implementation plans or processes of larger scale interventions and makes them more feasible, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So when we talk also, collaboration also as an approach is a key driver in the development of the two new universities, which I referred to earlier, with maybe the the Salt Lake University, probably the more not successful, but better example, let's put it that way, where because it's of its nature and integration within the fabric of Kimberley, and we had to merge with a far greater number of stakeholders. And much of the planning methodology was based in these cases on sort of what we would call radical planning and participatory approaches, with a focus of sort of decentralizing the planning process to involve broader input, by community and citizens. But despite also the fact that in South Africa, universities are quite insular, sort of insular islands, I do view campuses as an integral part of our civic urban space, and it really demands input and participation on a broader case. So, and our universities occupy large tracts of our inner cities or towns. Impacting vastly on the surrounds and urban environment, as I highlighted in some of the examples we've been surveying in Northwest and Rhodes. Maybe some of the more established institutions, the inclusions with city officials, neighboring property owners, businesses, as well as the student representation plays a key role in forming the urban design and as it evolves. And I'm using the example of Stellenbosch and Rhodes, where the growth of the institution has, from its inception, been an integral part of the city fabric. And I think that is one of the processes that we are trying to engage also in some of the other institutions, be it the University of Pretoria or at WITS, where I'm involved. Collaboration also finds sort of solid footing, although not uniquely in the use of competitions as a form of ensuring greater variety in large urban and institutional development. It also offers means and ways of greater numbers of professionals to participate, which is sometimes not the case in the way we do our larger built environment projects. Now, I'm using Melrose Arch as an example because its initial success was not only due to quite a clear spatial framework or development framework, but the client was convinced to introduce an architectural competition for at least the first part of the first phase. It sort of created a platform where new and young, diverse ideas were given a voice, and it forced greater joint effort and input, which resulted in my far more successful project than some of the projects that came later. It also showed, maybe, and this is the other aspect of successful urban developments, is that we too easily don't give proper briefs or receive proper briefs. And I think that the idea of codes and the development of codes, in this case with Osman Lang and Paul Moraine, it was a valuable lesson as to say, how do you manage and control large groups of professionals and in terms of a participatory process and ensure that we don't have complete chaos going. And I think this also, apart from that, has given a vehicle for a lot of established practices that are quite big today, be it Paragon, I think OMM Design Workshop were part of that. All of these practices had a way in through because of that. But it's, I think, unfortunate that idea got lost in future phases. And I don't want to knock that, but I think it just shows what happens if we revert back to the development of just one single practice, one block, one user. And in this case of the hotel, is some of the larger single design developments that have evolved in the same area, in contrast to some of the earlier phases that you see on the right there. The same process of competition and a broader group of design involvement is also the DTI development in Sunnyside, Pretoria. And maybe not as successful because the client insisted on enclosing the roof, the open space roof, in probably the most beautiful environment in South Africa. It really detracted a bit from it. But the incorporation of broader professional teams, stakeholders, and the guidelines that require and the coding that comes with it is an essential part to ensure successful development. And working with a variety of groups is in many people, probably in this very space that we are now, a painful experience, to say the least. But to establish a medium between what is conformity and individual expression is no easy task, and it's been something that I've been working with quite a long time. So, in my experience, a very successful example, sort of competitions and the notion of collaboration was used at the universities as well, at the new university, sorry. And I will come to that in a moment, where multiple teams were appointed to do a portion of work within a holistic or a greater framework and guideline. This stands in, say, as an example, in contradiction to some of the older universities. And here I'm referring to the former Rand Afrikaans University, which was designed without a recorded open competition process, and the appointment was basically a single source appointment, as we would call it in procurement terms. In this case, Meyer and Van Wyk development in the late 60s and 70s. The same also applies to the Brian Sandrock, the appointment for UNISA in Makkelnik, Pretoria. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this also up is the complexity of a single source or single design. Doesn't matter how good you are. It brings a certain level of sameness about it. These are incredible buildings, don't take me wrong. But to add on to that, to expand on those, has proven to be very difficult in some of my workings with these institutions, primarily due to their sort of singular identity and original spatial and architectural design. In the development of Solplaatje and the images that I'm showing you here, the University in Mpumalanga, the sort of the appointment of single architectural practices to complete all the project was rejected in favor of, as I said, multiple design development team. The underlying architects, by employing a single architect or practice, would lead, no matter how good and experienced that group might be, to systemization, repetition, monumentality, as mentioned earlier. Also, a further argument around against that was that these precedents were completed prior to the expansion of the academic program. And in some ways, the architecture imposes a premeditated character on the university. Instead, what we are trying to do is that the architecture should evolve and grow with the university and its academic program. And I think that's also, this approach offers a slightly a greater variety in terms of how it eventually expresses itself. Also, as I said, multiple firms were appointed within a sort of guidelines, which is not necessarily dictated by myself only, but it's dictated by the group and its self-approval within those groups that sort of assists with the design. And I think still we are really in our third and fourth stages of appointments of new professional teams, always 3 or 4 of those. And in the case, for instance, in Kimberley, we had 5 teams working on projects at the same time. Although the spatial guidance might be viewed as restrictive, I still think the diversity of the architecture and the architectural expression is apparent, and I think these institutions are well worth a visit if you were to pass through those cities at some point. Oh, those are just some more of these are mostly of the University of Mpumalanga residences and academic buildings that have evolved over the last 13 to 14 years. So a critical part, working with larger group is the guideline and codes that requires that sort of coherency and sort of holistic end result. Maybe just using a more commercial example, this is Devonbosch near Stellenbosch in collaboration with Henry Conry is a case in point. And when observing a lot of our urban developments or the approach we have in South Africa, it's typically through an overly rigid set of architectural guidelines, often dictating style, color, finishes, etc. Whilst having very poorly defined descriptions of the urban and larger scale envelopes. And I think what I'm trying to argue with these examples is it's more important, or actually the inverse of that, is that the guidelines for the envelope that deals with the heights, the location of landmarks, the ground floor uses, the overall fabric, the quality of the open spaces, they need to be strictly managed. But the architecture articulation should be open for greater interpretation. And I think that's maybe just the inverse of some of the examples that we find. So much of the work, my work over especially the last 15 years, is trying to establish a guideline of implementation without compromising the overall coherency of the urban area or the project, or to dictate to the institution or developers, and not restrict the design aspect of the architectural team. So I view, guidelines as a sort of it offers a roadmap. And even though the sort of final destination may not be quite known, and maybe applying Christopher Alexander's ideas, the aim is to describe the sort of core features of a solution to a specific spatial challenge in a way that you can use the solution a million times over without ever doing it the same way twice. And I think that's sort of what the role is of someone overseeing larger scale spatial development. So the guideline, in essence, stands in contrast to the idea of a rule, which offers sort of a very direct and specific roadmap. The pattern, rather, stands in contradiction to that. It raises issues that may need attention. It provides ideas and examples, so that can be used to address them. Thus, while a rule also bypasses people's intuition, the guidelines calls upon these very same intuitions, and it sort of attempts to educate and strengthens them in a process of solving a specific challenge or problem. So the field of study around guidelines and coding, it's an extensive one, which I think this discussion maybe doesn't do justice to, but I would encourage urban designers and architects to place much more emphasis on sort of the means to an improved holistic urban space and its implementation. An important part of our thinking, and which sort of builds from the idea of collaboration, is this idea of inquiry by design. And I would like to briefly share its relevance in some of the urban design methodologies that we've been using. And I believe it sort of supports a participatory process. It's for us key, especially when it comes to very complex urban design interventions and projects that were, and it was successfully applied in numerous ones, in this case, just the example of Tami Mnyele Park in Tembisa, where design proposals and ideas were sort of presented to the community on numerous places, and for them to respond, draw, comment, interface with some of the things on the plan and in their community, because by engaging like that, people felt or could give their sort of views. It stands also in opposition to sort of what we sometimes as like a linear engagement, where planning begins with a consultant being appointed to do work with a particular result in mind, and it hinges on information gathering as much upfront, analyzing the information, and then designing a master plan of some sort for a presentation to stakeholders. In contrast, we're trying to, with sort of this inquiry by designing, is to integrate constituent activities of, I would call, imagining, presenting, and testing. And through a sort of trial and error process, it allows the designer, and the urban designer in this case, to test input and conjectures, and offered by multiple stakeholders. And this creates sort of a constant shift of possible final results in line with sort of the new information received. And one can express it or describe it as a sort of a series of conceptual shifts or creative leaps in a way. And as designers, we aim to reach eventually one acceptable response within a range of possible solutions, or what I would call a domain of acceptance. And this sort of cyclical nature of the design process allows changes to take place without the need to, in many cases, we have to restart that process. To demonstrate, maybe as an example, in this case at University of Salt Lake, we developed stakeholder sessions, decision-making workshops to allow maximum access of a variety of stakeholders. We established a workspace, a workshop space within the Kimberley municipality, directly adjacent to the site where the university was planned. And planning and meetings, for instance, would be held on every morning with a variety of city stakeholders, local municipalities, and the like, to get their input and from say 8 to 11. From 12 to 4, we would then digest that information in drawing format as best we can. And then we would then present that in an exhibition format in the afternoon of 4 o'clock onwards, where the public and everyone can then again engage with that process, give input, and see how that whatever they've done the previous day comes to fruition in visual form. These sort of visual displays of large drawings and diagrams allow a better understanding of how this institution would develop. The process also allowed the design of the campus to be, expedited. It was just expedited, right? It was quite a rapid decision-making process, and all the affected parties, stakeholders, were close at hand, immediately available, resulting after about a 7-day process in us submitting to the municipal council, which was open to the public, and it was accepted. All of these sessions were well attended, and it also meant that it was seen as a collaborative approach by the city, as well as, in this case, the Department of Higher Education and Training. And the plan of the university became the plan of the city, and the plan of the city became the plan of the university. So also interesting that this plan hasn't actually changed in the 15 years since those workshops were concluded. As an example of some of these ideas, one of the proposals, both from the design team as well as from the city officials, is to create a student walk that goes through the campus and links the various sort of sub-campus to each other. And this idea eventually evolved to become the backbone of the implementation plan, and it has become the backbone for the development of the campus over the last 10 or 15 years. And it provides a sort of coherency along which one can understand the institution. So this original ideas from 15 years ago is still the one that is implemented and sort of really drives the identity of this space. So that brings me to sort of the fourth aspect, which is around placemaking. So when we ask about placemaking, so what should be considered to ensure a greater sense of civicness? What then is deemed important, if not, we always talk about service provisions and the like. So, and in many cases, I would be confronted from an urban development point of view. What is the fuss about public space or placemaking when we've got so many other issues, salient issues around housing, water, and electricity? Why bother with urbanity and sort of the constant fight for quality of public space? Placemaking and the importance of our public realm, and I share the opinion of Künstler in this, that it has two primary roles. Firstly, it is the place of our civic life, and secondly, it's the sort of physical manifestation of the common good. And when we degrade the public realm, we will automatically degrade the quality of our civic life and what our society stands for. So the quality of our environment and the ability to create spaces which are worth caring about, comes from a long culture of civic design, a body of knowledge that all of us around in this space have the method and skills to do, but in many cases are ignoring. And consequently, we do see the results around us. We've created, in many cases, environments where the emphasis has moved from the civic or the public to the private. And we have ensured that a greater part of our cities are not worth caring about. We have created streets and squares and public spaces not worth looking after. And who gives a damn, really, about the litter and grime if the spaces were not designed for the people to use? So if the space is not designed for you, you're not going to look after it in principle. So in many cases, our spaces are maybe only vehicular conduits, and we have forgotten that most of our society don't necessarily have means of private transport as a case in point. So this sort of aim to create, proud public spaces, sort of a sense of place worth caring for, it's really so important, as it not only informs us where we are geographically, but also where we are in our culture, where we come from, what kind of people we are, and sort of offers a glimpse to where we're going. And most importantly, it allows us to sort of, I think, dwell in a hopeful present. And if we look at our civic spaces and our public spaces, we have to ask if this really reflects of what we want to become, and how does in this case our architecture inform or distract from that course or this course. I think what I'd like to leave with this group is that it's our responsibility to create common spaces worth caring for. So, what makes good space? It's dependent on our ability to define space, employing the sort of vocabularies and syntaxes and rhythms and patterns of architecture. It's our responsibility as architects and planners and designers, and we cannot remove ourselves from that, which we are too often doing. So we consciously remove ourselves from the public edge, and if the long-term sustainability of our cities is to be assured, our spatial principles have to change dramatically or drastically, away from maybe more a narcissist approach to the self. It's also, and so public placemaking is a primary driver of all the urban design projects that I've been involved with. Again, case in point, Pike's central campus, which is the space which invites activities and events and shapes the surrounding building edges in terms of the activities, landmarking, functions around it. And like the methodologies of inclusion, participation, and placemaking, the understanding of normative design principles, and having qualified as an architect, this spatial principle, form, order, scale, proportion, and the like, hierarchy, orientation, also establish a foundation to assessing and designing an urban scale. So it's an important part of how you design space. And this maybe, although I sometimes dislike how we as an architecture profession have moved to an isolationist expression, I think the rigor of architectural formal language and the principles of assembly are still a very foundational reference for me, at least when designing open spaces and larger urban design projects. Maybe the last principle is around implementation and urban renewal within that sort of renewal process. I view the framework or an urban design framing as a strategy that should provide sort of basic long-term urban structures around which shorter-term implementation and development decisions can take place, which sort of all together jointly work towards a holistic view of the future. The underlying principle when we do phasing for a project of the scale, in this case a university or a town, is that it has to create its own urbanity and sense of identity right from the word go. Most large-scale developments, from my experience, have been sort of ad hoc approach, with the final vision only, coming to fruition in a decade or two. And the aim of the spatial framing is just sort of to establish a microcosm of what the completed projects is going to be from day one. And the phasing pattern should not only usually focus on buildings and infrastructure, but we use common space or public space as a starter. And the aim is to create sort of a squares and park as a first step. Further phases would then take the same principles going forward. As an example to demonstrate this is the development of this sort of central square, which was referred to in Solplaatje earlier. It was officially launched in 2013 as part of an implementation strategy of the sort of first campus, sub-campus. The space was designed and developed as a first step. The aim was to showcase the quality of the new university, and we wanted to embody and display its intentions to, and also something to converse with the university. Numerous banners depicting the future buildings and intentions of the new university were placed around it. And people were, from the inauguration, people from the city would visit the square. They read the banners, they have picnics in the space, they play soccer, watch the buildings around the central square evolve. Subsequent phases for the university aim to systematically add onto that. And so the central square then evolved eventually into the central walk. And I think this sort of steady engagement with the city as a handshake was a very important part in terms of as an implementation strategy. It also, by phasing it like this or implementing it like this, it reduces not only upfront infrastructure spend, but it builds confidence with the construction teams, the city officials, and all the stakeholders as a picture is developed from early on what the complete campus, in this case, is aiming to become. All right, so this, this all sounds fantastic, but or too good to be true, really. But not all our experiences have had the same sort of positive implementation outcome. Paul Weigers and I, in the early 2000s, embarked on investing in the inner city ourselves. And we bought a whole series of buildings, old flour mills and 6 adjacent buildings in Newtown, which was part of a largest 26 property sale from the Premier Mills Group at that stage. Over a 6-year period, we toiled energetically. It was a bit of a rodeo to regenerate the buildings and the immediate surrounds. The experience was a very valuable one, I must admit, and had some commendable results. But ultimately, it failed due to the lack of broader participation and collaboration, primarily on the side of the city in this case. I did start the conversation on the magnitude of our urban challenges, and the Joburg inner city must rate it as probably the primary one. But our Mills precinct development had demonstrated it's impossible for the individual or a single organization to emanate a turnaround, and it's only in the collective it becomes tenable. Now, here, I just want to make reference to organizations, in our case, for example, Josie My Josie, which is an urban regeneration interest group established as a platform to connect people who want to make a difference from various sectors of life. It is sort of some of these collective initiatives which offer, I think, viable propositions of urban regeneration. The example is of the refurbishment project of the Nelson Mandela Bridge, which since its construction had fallen into disrepair. It's only through joint initiatives by various stakeholders that it has been restored very recently. The Josie My Josie approach is no approach in terms of our implementation strategy that we spoke about. Sort of complete a small piece of urban space, a section, street, or pavement, eventually stitching them together in a holistic approach. But I think it would encourage you to investigate, and I would encourage you to investigate similar type of organization in your own city or neighborhood as the self-help initiatives offer a great vehicle of hope and turning our cities around. In conclusion, I want to stress the value of some reflective practice as an approach of inquiry. And this sort of lecture series and over this last year has offered has offered me that vehicle. And I think, being able to share this with you, I trust that there is some takeaways that you might enjoy from that. And thank you for your patience in listening to me.
Ludwig, thank you so much. Sometimes when a lecture flows so well by the presenter, you just don't want to interrupt at all. So I hope you didn't feel like the silence was awkward. Thank you so much, sir. Colleagues, I'll open the floor for any comments and questions. I really enjoyed that. I want to find out what your solutions would be in a situation where there would have been a singular group dealing with a campus, and you did highlight that it might be challenging to do additions. I guess having a number of practices or architects working together, when you bring all your work for a design review panel, you realize that somebody's highlighted an aspect that has to be incorporated in design that you may not have thought about, which I think is actually quite important. But in your experience, where you felt like perhaps a singular group of architects had done work before, what has been your solution in later editions?
Yeah, maybe the best way to answer that is one should avoid being the judge in these processes. And I think, again, when working in collaboration with, say, 5 or 6 professional teams, or architects in this case, possibly, and most of them highly skilled in their own fields, we do joint approvals of that. It's not as if I look at the guidance and say, no, you don't conform or any of that. The architectural practice who proposes a certain design has to argue their case, and it is then approved as a joint committee. So I've used that as a way of maybe then also enriching the process, getting additional views or improved views on maybe the guidelines that we put on the table. So that's probably the way to approach it, rather than having what would be like a approval committee that sort of, again, stands outside the design process. It's inside the process that the decision-making and the approval process needs to happen. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I get you. Thank you. I'd like to welcome people who joined us for the first time. I see quite a number of academics from Joburg, some colleagues from Joburg, colleagues from Cape Town, Adrian. Thank you so much for joining. Another question I have is inquiry by design. So I see that your design process is very rich, and it includes quite a number of stakeholders. Is that done within the expected design stages? Or do you have to present another way of packaging a project to the client? Obviously, there is time involved, and there is fees involved, and so a very thorough process that you do in your approach, which is these results. Sorry, that you've just showed us. Does it have much impact in the regular stages that we have as designers?
I personally find that by having these more intensive process of engagement with the relevant stakeholders and also consultants. It's not necessarily only end user groups and or cities. It also involves the whole professional team on our side, mostly the bulk engineering, design engineers. It actually speeds up the process. And otherwise, the back and forth, maybe working on a project, say in Kimberley, it's going to take forever. So I think it actually increases the efficiency of that process by confronting people with the skill that we have as architects or web designers in this case, with a solution. Immediately confront people with that, and then it's incredible how people then respond to that because they can see it. Because you often get into a talk shop and we talk past each other, but by putting and describing by way of design something that an idea, people can counter that very quickly. Say, no, you're actually transgressing over my property or this and that. So immediately people respond to that, and I think it just increases the speed at which this happens.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, then Ken.
Thanks, Ludwig. Beautiful presentation. What struck me was that image of your house in Johannesburg with a drinking fountain on the sidewalk and a view. Was that a garage door that has now become a view into your private world?
No, I designed the gate specifically. It's a remote control thing, which I open in the mornings when the students or the scholars come to the school, and even at night as well. Kids run around with their bicycles. Yeah, no, I've designed it specifically.
For me, the generosity of that gesture just talks about what you're about. We can only dream of city fathers, mothers, managers, whatever you want to call them, in this country being urban designers of the kind of ilk that how your brain thinks. Could we just dream about that for a minute? Imagine if Smith and West Streets, Pixie Kaseme and Anton Lamberde in Durban were transformed into linear markets, if you want. Get rid of a whole lot of traffic and allow it to become what Africa should become, which is generous sidewalks, generous public space, allow people to do what they need to do without paying astronomical rents inside shops. So that's just my comment, and beautiful images. Thank you. And it's nice to reconnect.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Maybe just as a side note on the water fountain, by the way. It's been there now for 17, 18 years. It has never broken. It's never been damaged. And people don't abuse it. That's an incredible, interesting part of that. The amount of goodwill that comes with goodwill is something that we've forgotten in our urban environment, and we've withdrawn from that. And I know this is a small example, but I think it's indicative of what can become.
Thank you so much, Lulu. Yeah, that's definitely humanity. Ken?
Thanks, Gura. Morning, Ludwig. Thank you very much for an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. Questions slightly more broad than the previous one from Jeremy. Any thoughts about our national aversion or infatuation with single-use development? We seem to be very averse to mixing living with working, with playing. I'm thinking particularly about those market developments you showed us. Just market. There's no living. There's no work. There's no light industrial working within it that I can see. And we build a single faculty maths and stats building. Why is there not living in it? What are our general, and the biggest single one, of course, of all, is our incredible rash of shopping centers we have in this country that are just shopping centers. They're only commercial. They have no living within them. Very few of them have, in fact, working within them. Some of them have play within them. What are your thoughts about the attitude of broadening mixed use and therefore obviously using space rather more efficiently? That's one question. The next question is, what are your thoughts about mixing methods of transport, mixing motor cars, trucks, bicycles, feet? Thank you. Okay, that's it for the time being. Thanks, Ludwig.
And sure. These are, things that we grapple with all the time. And maybe, our drive towards single use is a challenge across the board, and includes universities, for example. You're quite right, and I think your observation that development, both institutionally as well as commercially, is still driven by primarily single or limited variety of use. And maybe you will get a singular use, but if it sits within a broader fabric, let's take a street, and that's what we don't have as an example. You spoke about the market just being a market, but the market is next to housing, or right in the street with housing and the like that comes with it. So it's maybe not only that all buildings have to be functionally diverse, but that it's the urban fabric that within which it sits where the diversity should also happen. So I think we see, and that's where our expanding urban fabric in Joburg to the north and south is still in that form, because it's then zoned accordingly, and therefore we don't have any urban fabric. It's just that. And I think we are fighting with a whole variety of town planning regulations, large bulk infrastructure regulations, which dictate in many ways how the functional application becomes so singular. And I think we obviously try to create as much variety, in which then in turn becomes great efficiencies in that. I'll come back to the university maybe as an example. One of our biggest drivers at WITS, and I think some of the other institutions, I think University of Pretoria is quite successful in this, is expanding their footprint outwards. We, in our surveys, for instance, 80% of student life or experience, let's call it experience, is off campus, not on campus. And therefore, our understanding of how we ingrain our educational program into the city fabric is an extremely important one. And therefore, that the idea that teaching is not only lifelong, but everywhere, for instance, tries to mitigate this sort of idea that we only have teaching schools and the like as singular entities. So there are quite a number of there is a general move towards trying to create greater efficiencies by creating greater diversity of and use of our spaces. But it's challenging, massively challenging. I think you had a sort of brief thing about modes of transport and movement. Yes, again, it probably speaks to the same in terms of our functional diversity, the same with our transport diversity. And I think we are also very slow in engaging with that. And I think, again, a weak sort of government or provincial government or local government to enforce and strengthen public transport and or engagement with taxi and transport transport providers is something which is hampering that sort of diversity in that. So I think there is also a great opportunity or there's need rather for that diversity to happen. Sure, it's quite a difficult topic. I don't think I answered that sufficiently, but always give it a go.
Sure.
Thanks, Ludwig. I think also the problem we have, particularly in the smaller centres where we have limited resources and abilities, is the huge limitations we have with town planning and with a horrible thing called zoning. But thank you very much.
You're right.
Thank you, Ken. Ludwig, I just wanted to find out, in your experience working with campuses, especially existing campuses, for the number of years now, we've had a problem with student accommodation. The number of students that have been admitted versus where they can stay, especially on campus. what are the solutions for that?
Okay, again, maybe from just broadly speaking, we find that the private providers are far more efficient than the universities in terms of how they, there's the student accommodation happens and the quality that comes with it. So we are increasingly working together with private developers and service providers in terms of where our students live and the kind of qualities that they experience there. We've also, so that's on the one hand, and maybe, BITS or University of Pretoria in this case is far more privileged in terms of being able to manage these accommodation needs. So we are not necessarily building any new developments or new accommodation on our campuses, and it probably constitutes about 15% of our students living on campus. The rest is all privately managed. So we are starting to track exactly where our students live, and we are trying to provide within those environments certain amenities that we would have done internally on campus traditionally. So we don't. So I think that's one aspect of it. But the reality facing probably 80% of our students is funding. And we have systems like NSFAS and the like, which are not substantial enough to accommodate students, and therefore these sort of dire needs of our students, in many cases, really being destitute and or forced into accommodation which is wholly unsuitable as a home from home when doing their teaching, not only in terms of the accommodation, but also the food amenities that come with it. So yes, it is a broader national issue, but I think the universities are actually trying the level best to mitigate those processes by both dealing privately and where it's possible, as well as internally in terms of trying to maybe source other means of sourcing our accommodation for our students. But it's far more critical in maybe the more let's call them more rural environments where these sort of surrounding civic spaces don't necessarily have accommodation for the students to take up. Yeah. But it's quite a critical aspect of university life at the moment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ludwig. I'm not sure, colleagues, if anybody else has a comment or question, but thank you so much for that presentation. My friend Johan from the Free State.
Good morning, everyone. I'm sitting in the Cape Town, so attended the property development forums, the Western Cape presentations yesterday. Focus on residential and residing of people critical. I must first comment, what a wonderful presentation, really enjoyed. Sure, didn't know that architects have got so much to offer. So as architects, I think we have a great role to play. How do we deliver, say, 5.4 million homes in South Africa? It must be surely a very critical and important focus for us. The question is, do we want to elevate that to that level? Do we really want to take on the responsibility to co-deliver, if you will? And looking at all the developments and the urban design, why don't just include housing as a prerequisite for every development that we do? Because in all of those spaces are used by people and needs to be inhabited as well. So just maybe something, a national discussion on the delivery of housing for everyone in South Africa would be a great benefit for everyone. Thank you so much again, Skura, again for arranging this wonderful event.
Yeah, I concur. I think that is a valid comment, and I think we are missing so many opportunities within our cities of underutilized space and land, which is available to us, which hasn't been taken. And I think, yes, I think there needs to be a bigger, wider discourse on this, because unfortunately it feels like we're still replicating planning expansions of housing further and further from opportunities, and housing as a singular solution is also not the way forward either. So yeah, I think there is a dire need on that point, and I think architects and planners have an important role to fulfill in this, and we shouldn't remove ourselves from that discourse.
Thank you, Han. Ken again.
Thanks, Gura. Ludwig again. Any thoughts about whether we should be concentrating as we do on our major urban centers, as opposed to looking at maybe the establishment of viable villages, small towns, new towns, that we should be actually moving people to more useful and productive areas? Any thoughts about that?
Oh, Ken, you're asking me all these tough questions. I do think that the larger urban centers and the urbanization is a key driver in terms of providing better service delivery. And I think the solution is not necessarily saying all the big municipal areas, but I do think that a lot of the challenges we can address more centrally or collectively rather than dispersing them. And I think I think the development of Joburg, for example, and in its regeneration is critical in that development process. And then it should cascade down to maybe smaller regional towns or villages thereafter. But I do think we need to get our cities operating, because that is where most of the economic drivers are, work opportunities, social services. I think let's start with those. That would be my suggestion.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Ludwig. Thank you so much, colleagues. We are now closing the session. I'm not sure, Ludwig, if you have just some parting words before we close.
No, thanks for the opportunity, and yeah, I hope it was meaningful to some degree. Thanks.
It was. Thank you so much. Colleagues, thank you so much. The meeting is now adjourned. An announcement for Durban Architects on the 13th of June, if you can just note. We are having our Institute Shy friends from the Plans Department engaging us on submissions. It's on a Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m. at the Institute. So bring your questions and queries. I'd like to resolve all your concerns there. Thank you so much. May everybody have a good weekend. Thank you.